3 years before he met Olivia Hart, Alexander Sterling stood in a hospital corridor and listened as a doctor explained why his wife wasn't coming home. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. He remembered almost none of it afterward. What remained with him was not the explanation itself, but the expression on the doctor's face. It was the look people wore when they knew there was nothing they could say that would lessen the weight of what had happened. Rebecca Sterling had been driving home from a charity event outside New Haven when another vehicle lost control during a storm. The accident was sudden. The consequences were permanent. For months afterward, Alexander found himself replaying details that no longer mattered. He thought about the phone call he received that afternoon. He thought about the drive to the hospital and the long hours that followed. He thought about all the ordinary moments that had existed earlier that day, and how impossible it seemed that an entire future could disappear between breakfast and sunset. People often described grief as something dramatic. Alexander's experience was different. Most of the time, grief arrived quietly. It appeared in small moments that nobody else could see. It appeared when he reached for a second coffee cup in the morning, before remembering there was no reason to. It appeared when he walked through the front door after work and instinctively looked toward the living room. It appeared whenever something happened that he wanted to tell Rebecca about, before remembering that she was no longer there to listen. He and Rebecca had been married for 29 years, long enough that most people who knew them struggled to imagine one without the other. They met in college, built careers together, raised 2 children, survived difficult years, and eventually enjoyed successful ones. By the time they reached their 50s, they had developed the kind of relationship that rarely attracted attention because it lacked drama. There were no grand declarations, no constant battles, and no endless attempts to prove their devotion. What existed between them was something quieter and far more durable. They genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Even after decades together, conversation came easily. That was what Alexander missed most. Not the vacations, not the celebrations, not the photographs. He missed the conversations. Rebecca possessed a rare ability to challenge his thinking without turning disagreement into conflict. She asked questions that forced him to examine ideas from different angles. Some of the most important business decisions he ever made began as casual discussions around their kitchen table late at night, after the children had gone to bed. When she died, Alexander lost far more than a wife. He lost the person who understood him best. The years that followed felt strangely disconnected from everything that came before them. From the outside, very little appeared to change. Alexander remained the owner and publisher of Modern Avenue, one of the most respected lifestyle magazines in the country. What had started decades earlier as a relatively small publication had grown into a nationally recognized brand covering fashion, culture, architecture, design, business, and contemporary life. The magazine reached millions of readers each month and generated the kind of success most entrepreneurs spend entire careers pursuing. Financially, Alexander had little left to prove. He lived comfortably in Manhattan. He traveled whenever work required it. His name carried influence throughout the industry. Universities invited him to speak. Television networks requested interviews. Young entrepreneurs often sought his advice. People who met him for the first time usually assumed he must be happy. Success creates that illusion. What those people rarely saw were the evenings. Most nights, Alexander stayed at the office far longer than necessary. Officially, he blamed deadlines, meetings, and the demands of running a publication. The truth was less complicated. Work provided structure. Work filled time. Work allowed him to postpone returning to an apartment that felt far larger than it once had. His children noticed the change long before he acknowledged it himself. Noah and Madeline were adults now, both building successful lives of their own, yet they remained close to their father. They visited often. They called regularly. They worried about him more than he realized. Neither pushed too hard. Both understood that grief followed its own schedule. Eventually, Alexander stopped pretending things would return to what they had been before. Instead, he adapted. He built routines, focused on work, accepted invitations when necessary, declined most social events when possible. Life continued moving forward whether he participated enthusiastically or not. At some point during those years, he also stopped thinking seriously about relationships. The decision wasn't motivated by anger or disappointment. He wasn't cynical about love. If anything, he respected it too much. His marriage to Rebecca had been meaningful enough that he couldn't imagine trying to recreate it with someone else. Over time, he came to view that chapter of his life as complete. Not tragic, not unfinished, simply complete. The possibility that something unexpected might still be waiting ahead never crossed his mind. That was why the invitation from Boston seemed so unimportant when it first arrived. The Boston Institute of Communications wanted him to participate in a guest lecture series. The topic concerned leadership, reputation, and the role trust played in building successful organizations. Similar invitations appeared in his inbox throughout the year, and his first instinct was to decline. Public speaking had become routine long ago. The dean persisted. Several emails became a phone call. The phone call became a longer conversation. Eventually, Alexander agreed. The decision felt entirely ordinary. Months later, he would remember it differently. The lecture took place on a warm spring afternoon. The auditorium was nearly full by the time Alexander arrived. Students occupied most of the seats while professors and faculty members gathered along the sides of the room. The atmosphere carried the familiar energy found on university campuses everywhere. Some students appeared intensely focused. Others looked distracted. A few seemed as though they had arrived only because attendance was required. A few minutes before the event began, Alexander stood backstage reviewing notes he had already memorized. As he waited for his introduction, the auditorium doors opened and another group of students entered. His attention shifted in their direction briefly, long enough to notice a young woman near the center of the group. She wore a blue dress and appeared to be laughing at something one of her friends had said. There was nothing particularly dramatic about the moment. Students arrived late all the time. Yet something about her presence caught his attention before he returned his focus to the lecture waiting ahead. A few minutes later, he walked onto the stage. The presentation was titled, "Building Trust in an Age of Endless Noise." For the next 90 minutes, Alexander discussed credibility, leadership, reputation, and the challenges facing modern organizations. He spoke about mistakes he had made during his career, lessons learned through experience, and the difference between attracting attention and earning trust. The audience remained engaged throughout. Students took notes. Questions were written down. Discussions continued even before the presentation ended. When the moderator finally opened the floor, dozens of hands immediately rose into the air. Alexander answered questions about entrepreneurship, media, leadership, and professional growth. Most were thoughtful, a few were predictable. Then he noticed a familiar face several rows from the front. The young woman in the blue dress had raised her hand. When the moderator called on her, she stood and waited for the room to settle. Her question was simple. If trust was the most valuable thing a person or organization could earn, what was harder to rebuild after it had been broken? Other people's trust in you or your own trust in yourself? The room grew noticeably quieter. Alexander paused before answering. Not because the question was difficult, because it felt familiar. Years earlier, Rebecca had asked him something remarkably similar during a late-night conversation in their kitchen. He could still remember the discussion. The memory arrived so unexpectedly that for a brief moment, the auditorium seemed to disappear around him. He answered carefully. The student listened. Then she asked another question, and then another. Each revealed genuine curiosity rather than a desire to impress anyone in the room. By the end of the exchange, Alexander found himself more engaged than he had been at any point during the lecture itself. Eventually, the event came to an end. Students filtered out of the auditorium. Faculty members thanked him for participating. Business cards changed hands. Photographs were taken. The afternoon unfolded exactly as countless similar events had unfolded before. Yet something remained with him during the journey back to New York. That evening, Alexander sat alone in his apartment overlooking Manhattan. A stack of documents waited on his desk. Several unanswered emails required attention. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the windows. Normally, work would have occupied his thoughts. Instead, he found himself remembering a question, then another, and the young woman who had asked them. For years, most people had passed through his life without leaving much behind. They came, they went, and eventually their faces blurred into memory. Yet long after the lecture had ended, and long after he had returned to New York, he could still hear a question asked by a young woman in a blue dress. And although he didn't understand why, the thought stayed with him. When Alexander returned to New York after the lecture, he expected the memory of Boston to fade naturally. Most experiences did. Over the years, he had spoken at universities across the country, attended conferences on several continents, and met thousands of people whose names and faces eventually blended together. Even the most successful events rarely occupied his thoughts for more than a few days before work demanded his attention again. This time was different, though not in any way he could immediately explain. The question remained with him, not because it had been extraordinary. Alexander had spent decades surrounded by intelligent people. He had heard extraordinary questions before. What lingered was the feeling that accompanied it. Something about the discussion reminded him of conversations he used to have with Rebecca. The same curiosity, the same willingness to challenge an idea without turning disagreement into an argument. The same instinct to look beyond the obvious answer and examine what existed underneath it. Several weeks later, another invitation arrived from the Boston Institute of Communications. The communications department was organizing a follow-up lecture and hoped he would participate. Alexander accepted. The decision required very little thought. The second event felt different from the moment he entered the auditorium, partly because the campus was familiar now, partly because he immediately recognized a face in the audience. Olivia Hart sat several rows from the front, a notebook resting on her lap. She listened with the same attentiveness he remembered from their first meeting. When the discussion portion of the event began, her hand rose among dozens of others. The conversation that followed lasted several minutes. What impressed Alexander was not simply the quality of her questions, but the way she listened to answers. Most people entered discussions hoping to confirm what they already believed. Olivia seemed genuinely interested in understanding perspectives that differed from her own. The lecture ended. Students left. The afternoon moved on. Yet when Alexander boarded his train back to New York later that evening, he found himself remembering portions of that conversation more clearly than anything else that had happened during the day. The pattern repeated itself over the following months. The university invited him back several times. Sometimes the topic involved leadership, sometimes media, sometimes branding and communication. The subjects changed. The audience changed. Olivia remained a constant presence. She attended nearly every lecture. Sometimes she asked questions. Sometimes she simply listened. Their interactions remained limited to public settings. Yet Alexander gradually formed an impression of her that extended beyond the classroom. She was intelligent without being performative, confident without arrogance, curious without needing to prove herself. In an environment where many students were understandably focused on building careers and creating opportunities, Olivia seemed motivated by something simpler. She genuinely enjoyed learning. One afternoon, after a lecture had ended, a professor mentioned that Olivia was among the strongest graduate students the program had produced in years. The observation felt unsurprising. Alexander had already reached a similar conclusion himself. By autumn, Boston no longer felt like another destination on his calendar. The city had become familiar. The university had become familiar. And without fully realizing it, so had Olivia. The first real conversation between them happened by accident. Alexander had developed a habit whenever work brought him to Boston. Before returning to New York, he often stopped at a small cafe near the university. The place served excellent coffee and some of the best croissants he had found outside Manhattan. More importantly, it reminded him of cafes Rebecca used to enjoy during their travels. On a cool Saturday morning, he entered expecting nothing more than breakfast and an hour of quiet reading. Instead, he immediately recognized several students gathered around a large table near the windows. Olivia was among them. One of her friends noticed him first. Greetings were exchanged. An invitation followed. Moments later, Alexander found himself sitting with a group of graduate students discussing subjects that had nothing to do with lectures, publishing, or professional obligations. The conversation moved naturally between books, films, journalism, technology, politics, and the changing nature of modern communication. Unlike many professional gatherings Alexander attended, nobody seemed interested in networking or impressing anyone. People disagreed freely, challenged one another's opinions, and occasionally laughed at themselves when discussions became overly serious. Hours passed far more quickly than expected. When Alexander eventually glanced at his watch, he realized nearly 2 hours had disappeared. The realization seemed to surprise everyone. What began as a casual greeting had evolved into an unexpectedly enjoyable morning. Before leaving, several students asked questions about Modern Avenue. Most had never visited a major publication and were curious about what happened behind the scenes. Alexander answered what he could. Eventually, he suggested that if any of them happened to visit New York, he would be happy to show them around. The suggestion seemed casual at the time. A few weeks later, it became reality. Several students traveled to Manhattan and spent a day touring the headquarters of Modern Avenue. They met editors, designers, photographers, and marketing executives. They observed meetings, asked questions, and gained a clearer understanding of how a national publication functioned. Olivia stood out for a different reason than most of her classmates. Many students were fascinated by success. Olivia seemed fascinated by process. She wanted to understand how decisions were made, why certain stories were chosen, why some ideas succeeded while others failed. The distinction did not go unnoticed. As the months passed, occasional conversations gradually became regular ones. When Alexander visited Boston, they often met for coffee, sometimes lunch. Occasionally, they walked across campus between lectures and meetings. The subjects varied constantly: publishing, history, architecture, current events, books. Neither of them spoke extensively about their personal lives. The friendship developed through shared interests rather than personal disclosures. There was an ease to their conversations that neither felt the need to analyze. One afternoon, after spending nearly 2 hours discussing a feature story Olivia was helping research, they left a cafe and stepped onto the sidewalk outside. As they waited for the traffic light to change, Olivia glanced back through the window. A woman seated near the rear of the cafe appeared to be watching them. Not casually, with the kind of attention people gave situations they believed they understood. A few moments later, the woman leaned toward her companion and quietly said something while looking in their direction again. Olivia looked away. The moment itself lasted only seconds. The feeling it created remained much longer. After they crossed the street, she grew quieter than usual. Eventually, she asked whether he ever thought people created stories about strangers simply because they happened to witness a single moment of their lives. Alexander considered the question. Then he said that people rarely had enough information to understand what they were seeing, but that rarely prevented them from reaching conclusions. Most of the time, he added, people preferred simple explanations because complexity required patience. Olivia nodded. The conversation moved elsewhere. Neither mentioned the woman again. Yet the incident remained somewhere in the background. For the first time, both became aware that their friendship might look different to outside observers than it did to them. Winter approached gradually. The campus became quieter. Days grew shorter. Their conversations continued. Neither of them was searching for anything beyond friendship. At least that was how they understood it. What existed between them felt easy, comfortable, and entirely natural. It had grown slowly enough that neither could identify the exact moment it became important. They simply knew that when something interesting happened, they often wanted to tell the other person about it. And without realizing it, both had begun looking forward to those conversations long before they actually happened. Winter settled over Boston slowly. The sidewalks grew quieter, daylight disappeared earlier each afternoon, and the university entered that familiar period when students seemed to move through campus, carrying equal amounts of exhaustion and determination. The semester was approaching its busiest stretch, and conversations everywhere revolved around deadlines, research projects, presentations, and plans for the future. Alexander continued visiting the university throughout those months. What had begun as a speaking engagement had gradually become something more meaningful. The lectures remained important, but they were no longer the primary reason he looked forward to traveling to Boston. Increasingly, he found himself looking forward to the conversations that happened afterward. By then, he and Olivia had established a rhythm that felt completely natural. Sometimes they met for coffee, sometimes lunch. Occasionally, they spent hours discussing books, journalism, history, architecture, or whatever subject happened to capture their attention that day. Neither of them tried to force the friendship into something it wasn't. The connection existed comfortably on its own, which was perhaps why neither noticed how important it had become until much later. One afternoon, a snowstorm forced the cancellation of several university events. Alexander's train back to New York was delayed, leaving him with an unexpected stretch of free time before evening. He and Olivia ended up at a small cafe overlooking the Charles River. Outside, snow drifted steadily across the city. Inside, conversations unfolded at a slower pace than usual. For a while, they discussed ordinary things: work, classes, a recent article in Modern Avenue. Then the conversation drifted somewhere more personal. Alexander spoke about Rebecca, not about her death, about her life. He talked about the years they spent together, the challenges they overcame, and the strange reality of reaching a point where nearly every meaningful memory in your life involved another person. He described the way Rebecca approached problems, the questions she asked, and the way she seemed capable of seeing possibilities where other people saw obstacles. Olivia listened quietly. When he finished speaking, she remained silent for several moments. Then she told him she understood more than people usually assumed. Not because she had experienced the same kind of loss, because she understood what it felt like when trust disappeared. It was the first time she spoke openly about Jason Miller. She had met him during her final year of college. At the time, he seemed like the sort of person who made difficult decisions look easy. He was ambitious, confident, and unusually certain about the future. While many people their age were still trying to figure out who they wanted to become, Jason always appeared convinced he already knew. Olivia admired that confidence. Their relationship developed quickly. Within 2 years, they were engaged. Several months later, they were married. Looking back, she could identify warning signs she had ignored, but hindsight often creates clarity that doesn't exist in real time. During those years, she believed she was building a future with someone she trusted completely. The first year of marriage appeared successful from every outside perspective. They rented an apartment in Boston, built routines, made plans, discussed careers, discussed future goals. Friends saw a happy couple. Family members saw stability. Olivia saw the same thing. The problems emerged gradually enough that she never recognized them as problems while they were happening. Jason became increasingly protective of his phone. His schedule grew more unpredictable. Business dinners multiplied. Weekend meetings appeared unexpectedly. Every explanation sounded reasonable because it had been designed to sound reasonable. None of the individual moments felt significant. Together, they formed a pattern she chose not to examine too closely. At the same time, Ashley Cooper remained one of the most important people in her life. The friendship stretched back years. Ashley had stood beside her at the wedding, helped choose her dress, helped organize celebrations, shared countless memories long before Jason entered the picture. Trusting Ashley required no effort because that trust had been built over such a long period of time. The possibility that Ashley could become part of the story never crossed her mind. The truth arrived on an ordinary Thursday. Years later, Olivia still remembered small details from that day. She remembered the weather forecast. She remembered a conversation with a coworker shortly before leaving the office. She remembered thinking about dinner while driving home. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing suggested that by evening her life would look completely different. Ashley had called earlier that afternoon asking about a document she needed for a project. Olivia promised to look for it after work. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When she arrived home, she noticed Jason's car parked outside the building. He was supposed to be meeting a client across town. At first, she was pleased. Unexpected evenings together had become rare. She entered the apartment and immediately sensed something she would struggle to explain afterward. Nothing looked wrong, yet something felt wrong. Then she heard voices. One belonged to Jason, the other belonged to Ashley. Even years later, Olivia could not clearly remember the walk down the hallway. What remained vivid was the strange certainty that arrived before she reached the bedroom door. Somewhere inside, she already understood what she was about to find. The discovery itself lasted only seconds. The consequences lasted years. What surprised her most was not the betrayal. It was the disbelief. Looking at Jason and Ashley, she felt as though she were staring at two people she had never actually known. They looked exactly the same as they had the day before, yet everything she believed about them had disappeared. Over the following days, more details emerged. The relationship had lasted nearly a year. Months of lies suddenly became visible. Conversations she once remembered fondly acquired entirely different meanings. Shared dinners, holidays, celebrations, and ordinary evenings all looked different once she understood what had been happening behind her back. That realization proved more painful than the affair itself. The betrayal wasn't limited to one evening. It stretched backward through months of memories. Every memory required re-examination. Every certainty disappeared. The marriage ended not long afterward. The legal process moved relatively quickly, but emotional recovery followed a different schedule. For a long time, Olivia questioned her own judgment more than she questioned Jason's actions. She wondered how she had missed so many signs, how she had trusted so completely, and whether she could ever trust another person in the same way again. Eventually, she stopped looking backward. She focused on graduate school, focused on building a career, focused on creating a future that depended on her own efforts rather than promises made by someone else. The strategy worked. Her life regained direction. The anger faded. The disappointment softened. Yet some consequences remained. Trust became something she offered more carefully than before. By the time she finished speaking, the snow outside had begun to cover the streets in white. The cafe had grown quieter. Several tables sat empty. Alexander listened without interruption. He understood that certain experiences altered people permanently, even when they appeared healed from the outside. Loss left marks that were not always visible. Some people carried them openly. Others learned to carry them quietly. The conversation eventually moved elsewhere. The afternoon ended. The storm passed. Later that evening, Alexander returned to New York. Normally, he would have spent the remainder of the night reviewing reports or preparing for meetings scheduled later in the week. Instead, he found himself unable to concentrate. Several documents remained open on his desk, but he read the same pages repeatedly without absorbing any of the information. Eventually, he stood, crossed the apartment, and opened a drawer he had not touched in months. Inside were photographs, letters, birthday cards, anniversary notes, small pieces of a life that had once felt complete. He sat down and picked up a photograph of Rebecca. For several minutes, he simply looked at it. Then he unfolded an old note written in her handwriting. The message itself was ordinary, a reminder about dinner plans. Nothing important. Yet seeing her words on paper affected him more than he expected. For years, loving Rebecca and remembering Rebecca had felt like the same thing. Now he wasn't so sure. The question troubling him had very little to do with Olivia, and almost everything to do with the life he had spent years protecting. He wasn't afraid of caring about someone again. What unsettled him was the possibility that moving forward might somehow feel like moving away from Rebecca, even though a rational part of him understood that the two things were not the same. Love was not a limited resource. Memories were not erased by new experiences. The logic seemed obvious. The emotions were far more complicated. As midnight approached, Rebecca's photographs remained spread across the table beside him. For the first time since her death, Alexander found himself confronting a possibility he had carefully avoided. Perhaps the hardest part of moving forward was accepting that doing so did not mean leaving anyone behind. The thought stayed with him long after the lights of Manhattan faded beyond the windows. Not because he had found an answer, because for the first time in years, he had finally allowed himself to ask the question. By the time spring arrived, neither Alexander nor Olivia could honestly claim that their relationship existed only as a friendship. The realization had not arrived suddenly. There was no dramatic confession, no single moment that separated the past from the future. Instead, the change happened the way many important changes happen in real life. It developed gradually through accumulated moments that seemed insignificant on their own, but impossible to ignore when viewed together. A conversation that lasted longer than expected. A message sent simply because something interesting happened during the day. A recommendation for a book, a shared article. A lunch that turned into an entire afternoon. Months earlier, neither would have described those moments as meaningful. Now both understood they had become exactly that. What complicated matters was not the connection itself. It was everything surrounding it. Alexander was 53. Olivia was 25. Neither had forgotten that fact. They had simply spent so much time focusing on who the other person was that they occasionally stopped thinking about how the relationship appeared from the outside. Reality eventually reminded them. A week before graduation, Olivia received a message from a classmate she barely knew. The message contained a screenshot from a university discussion forum. At first, she assumed it was related to an upcoming project or campus event. Instead, she found a photograph. The image had been taken outside a cafe near the university. She recognized the location immediately. She also recognized the two people in the photograph. One was her. The other was Alexander. Nothing about the image itself seemed unusual. They were simply walking down the sidewalk after a conversation. Yet the comments beneath the photograph transformed an ordinary moment into something entirely different. Some focused on the difference in age. Others questioned Alexander's motives. Several suggested that Olivia's growing opportunities had less to do with ability and more to do with proximity to an influential publisher. A few comments were subtle. Many were not. By the time she finished reading, she felt less angry than disappointed. The people writing those comments knew almost nothing about either of them. Yet they appeared remarkably confident in their conclusions. She read the discussion twice. Not because she believed any of it, because she understood how easily other people would. The internet had always rewarded certainty more than accuracy. That reality was hardly new. Seeing herself become part of it felt different. Later that evening, she sent the screenshots to Alexander. They met the following afternoon. He read every comment carefully. Then he set the phone on the table and remained silent for several moments. Neither seemed particularly surprised. The possibility had existed from the beginning. A relationship like theirs invited assumptions before explanations ever had a chance to arrive. Alexander eventually looked across the table. He told Olivia that if she wanted to step away, he would understand completely. He explained that he never wanted her future complicated because of him. She was at the beginning of her life and career. The last thing he wanted was for public speculation, however small, to become a burden she felt obligated to carry. Olivia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she reminded him that she had already experienced what it felt like when trust was actually broken. She had lived through betrayal. She had watched people she loved choose dishonesty over loyalty. Compared to that experience, the opinions of strangers seemed remarkably unimportant. The people posting those comments did not know her. They did not know him. They certainly did not know what existed between them. If she had learned anything from her marriage to Jason, it was that reality and appearance were often very different things. Alexander smiled, not because the situation was amusing, because he recognized the conviction behind her words. The conversation ended there. The screenshots disappeared into the background. Life continued. Yet the incident changed something subtle between them. For the first time, they stopped discussing hypothetical concerns and started confronting real ones. The judgment they feared was no longer theoretical. It existed. And despite that reality, neither had chosen to leave. As graduation approached, other questions became more difficult to ignore. Alexander found himself thinking increasingly about the future. Not the abstract future he discussed in business meetings or strategic planning sessions. A personal future. One that included Olivia. The realization still felt unfamiliar. For years after Rebecca's death, he had trained himself not to think that way. The habit proved difficult to break. One evening, he found himself walking through Central Park alone after returning from Boston. The city around him carried the familiar energy of late spring. People filled outdoor cafes. Runners moved along crowded paths. Families occupied benches overlooking the water. Alexander walked without any particular destination in mind. His thoughts returned to Rebecca, as they often did. What surprised him was that the memory no longer arrived accompanied exclusively by sadness. For years, remembering Rebecca had felt inseparable from grief. Now the memories felt different, softer, more complete. He remembered laughter more often than loss, conversations more often than funerals, the life they built rather than the way it ended. That change mattered. It allowed him to recognize something he had resisted for a very long time. Loving Rebecca and loving Olivia were not competing experiences. One did not diminish the other. The heart did not operate according to the rules people often imagined. It did not replace. It expanded. The realization arrived quietly. Yet once it arrived, it refused to leave. Several days later, Alexander called Noah. The conversation began with ordinary topics before gradually moving toward more personal territory. Eventually, he asked a question he had been considering for weeks. How would you feel if I decided to marry again someday? The answer came faster than Alexander expected. Noah said he would be happy, not tolerant, not accepting. Happy. The distinction mattered. A few days later, Alexander spoke with Madeline. Her response was remarkably similar. Neither child appeared surprised by the question. In fact, both seemed relieved that he was finally asking it. Madeline eventually told him something he would remember long afterward. Olivia did not remind her of Rebecca because they looked alike. They didn't. She reminded her of Rebecca because she listened the same way. Because she asked questions the same way. Because she challenged people without making them feel attacked. Those were the qualities Madeline remembered most vividly from childhood. Not appearances. Character. When the call ended, Alexander remained seated in silence for several minutes. He realized his children understood something before he did. The person who entered his life was never a replacement for Rebecca. She was simply someone entirely different, who happened to possess some of the qualities he had always admired most. By the time graduation week arrived, Alexander had made a decision. He carried it quietly. He discussed it with no one, not even Olivia. Yet every time he looked at her during those final weeks of the semester, the certainty grew stronger. The decision wasn't driven by loneliness, or fear, or age. It emerged from something far simpler. For nearly 3 years after Rebecca's death, Alexander had moved through life believing the most meaningful chapter of his story had already been written. Then, a young woman in a blue dress walked into a university auditorium and asked a question. Everything that followed began there. And now, for the first time in a very long while, he found himself thinking not about the life he had lost, but about the life he wanted to build. By the time graduation arrived, Boston had fully emerged from winter. The campus looked different than it had during those long months of snow and gray skies. Students gathered on lawns between buildings, families filled walkways carrying flowers and cameras, and a sense of anticipation seemed to follow every conversation. For the graduating class, an important chapter was ending. For Olivia Hart, it felt as though several chapters were ending at once. Graduate school had never been only about education. When she first enrolled, she was still recovering from the collapse of her marriage. Much of her confidence had been rebuilt during those years. The degree represented hard work, certainly, but it also represented resilience. Every demanding semester, every difficult project, and every long night spent studying had become part of a larger process of rebuilding a life she once believed had been permanently damaged. Now she was preparing to walk across a stage and receive the diploma she had spent years working toward. What she did not know was that another moment waited only a few hours away. Alexander arrived early that morning. Officially, he was attending as a guest of the university. In reality, he would not have chosen to be anywhere else. From his seat inside the auditorium, he watched graduates take their places, while families searched for familiar faces among hundreds of students dressed in identical gowns. The atmosphere felt joyful and emotional in equal measure. Parents tried not to cry. Friends promised to stay in touch. Professors shook hands with students they had spent years teaching. When Olivia's name was announced, Alexander felt an unexpected surge of pride. The feeling surprised him. He had not guided her career. He had not opened doors for her. Everything she achieved belonged entirely to her own effort. Yet watching her cross the stage, he felt privileged to have witnessed part of that journey. The ceremony ended shortly after noon. Photographs followed, families gathered, celebrations began. Olivia spent much of the afternoon moving between relatives, friends, professors, and classmates who wanted to congratulate her. At some point, Alexander asked whether she had time for one more walk across campus before dinner. The request seemed perfectly ordinary. Over the previous 2 years, they had spent countless hours walking through the university together. She agreed immediately. Only when he guided her toward the auditorium where they first met, did curiosity begin to grow. The building was quiet now. Most graduates were celebrating elsewhere. The hallways stood empty. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating the same space where a single question had changed the direction of 2 lives. Olivia followed Alexander inside. The auditorium was completely empty. Rows of seats stretched toward the stage. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt strangely meaningful. The room carried memories now, not only for Alexander, for both of them. He walked toward the stage and turned to face her. When he finally spoke, his voice carried easily through the empty room. He told her that 3 years earlier he had believed a significant part of his life was over. After Rebecca's death, he had continued working, continued living, and continued moving forward because that was what people were expected to do. Yet beneath all of it existed a certainty he never questioned. He believed that the part of his life connected to love belonged entirely to the past. Not because he stopped loving Rebecca. That had never happened. What disappeared was the belief that he could ever build something meaningful again. Then he accepted an invitation to speak at a university in Boston. A routine decision. An ordinary lecture. An afternoon that seemed no different from hundreds of others. Yet during that lecture, a student asked a question that reminded him of conversations he thought existed only in memory. The memory stayed with him. The student stayed with him. And over time, so did everything that followed. Alexander spoke about the coffees, the conversations, the long walks through campus, and the countless discussions that somehow made hours feel like minutes. He spoke about friendship, trust, and the quiet way important people sometimes enter our lives without announcing themselves. Most importantly, he spoke about what Olivia had given him without ever intending to. She had not healed his grief. No one could have done that. She had shown him something he had forgotten. The future still existed, not as an obligation, not as something to endure, as something worth looking forward to. By then, tears had already appeared in Olivia's eyes. Alexander reached into his jacket and removed a small velvet box. Everything that followed happened exactly the way neither of them would later remember it. She laughed and cried at the same time. He attempted to finish what he wanted to say. She nodded before he reached the end. The answer arrived long before the question did. Their wedding took place that autumn. The ceremony reflected who they were, elegant without being excessive, meaningful without trying too hard to be memorable. Family and close friends gathered to celebrate something neither Alexander nor Olivia had expected to find. Noah stood beside his father. Madeline delivered a speech that left much of the room in tears. At one point, she spoke about watching happiness return to someone who had spent years believing it was gone forever. The words stayed with many people long after the evening ended. Married life brought fewer changes than outsiders might have expected. The foundation of their relationship remained exactly what it had always been: friendship. They continued debating books, continued sharing articles, continued losing track of time during conversations. The things that brought them together never disappeared. A year later, another unexpected chapter began. Their son was born on a clear spring morning. Holding him for the first time felt almost impossible to process. Alexander had experienced fatherhood before, yet standing there with Olivia beside him and a newborn child in his arms, he felt the same mixture of awe and gratitude he remembered from decades earlier. Noah and Madeline embraced their younger brother immediately. The age difference between them seemed irrelevant. Family had never been measured by numbers. Months later, on an ordinary evening, Alexander sat in the living room holding the sleeping child while Olivia read nearby. Nothing remarkable was happening. No milestone, no celebration, no dramatic event. Outside, the sun was beginning to disappear below the horizon. Inside, the house was quiet. Alexander looked around the room and found himself thinking about how different life had become. Not better than before, not worse. Simply different. Rebecca remained part of his story. She always would. The years they spent together had shaped everything that came afterward. Nothing could erase that. Nothing should. For a long time, Alexander believed moving forward required leaving part of the past behind. Experience eventually taught him otherwise. The people we love never stop being part of us. They travel with us through every chapter that follows. As evening settled around the house, he watched Olivia turn a page in her book and listened to the quiet breathing of the child sleeping in his arms. Years earlier, he stood in a hospital corridor convinced that grief would be the defining chapter of the rest of his life. He was wrong. For a long time, Alexander thought grief was the final chapter. It wasn't. It was simply the chapter he happened to be living in. The story continued, and against all expectations, some of its most beautiful pages were still waiting ahead. If this story made you feel something, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us what you would have done in the main character's place, and subscribe to Sinner Stories so you never miss a new video.